Well, great. Well, thank you all for coming to this author series event here at the Harvard Club of Boston. My name is John Cornish. I'm chair of the author series here at the club. And it's my great privilege today to introduce two great authors, both preeminent intellectuals in their fields, the renowned historian Niall Ferguson and the world's leading expert on network science, physicist Laszlo Barabasi, who together will be enlightening us with their conversation. Niall's recently published book, The Square and the Tower, Networks, Hierarchies, and the Struggle for Global Power, draws upon lessons from network theory to better understand the evolution of power structures across world history. In discussing network theory with an audience in Budapest recently this year, Niall cited Laszlo as perhaps the most impressive thinker I've ever encountered in all the reading that I've done on this subject. Of all the times the light bulb went off above my head, and my God, it went off a lot in researching this book, it was never brighter than when I was reading his work. He also noted that he had, quote, never met the man, so he first met him, actually, is meeting him tonight. As I mentioned, tonight these two great minds are meeting, and I can guarantee you that the light bulbs will be going over all of our heads tonight as well. While it might seem otherwise curious to pair a historian and a physicist together in conversation, it's actually in the nature of network research to be collaborative and interdisciplinary, in part because networks are ubiquitous, and in part because the findings developed in one area often have remarkably broad applicability, deriving insights in quite different fields. This will be evident to anyone who has read Laszlo's book, Linked, which to me is a bit like the origin of species for network theory. And so, fittingly, network theory itself turns out to be a great connector of ideas. Even within fields like medicine, where advances have tended to lead to specialization, Laszlo and his team are coming up with new dimensions for analyzing disease across the body's networks. This type of research always starts from a place of intellectual humility, with the network scientist and the domain expert trading knowledge back and forth in the hope of yielding some new truth. To quote Laszlo from another fantastic book of his, Bursts, "Imagination is at the heart of all innovation. Crush it or constrain it, and the fun will vanish." Indeed, I think this is the common spirit. It is this common spirit of delight in discovering and sharing new ideas and insights that makes both of these authors so fun to read. I think it's also why they write so well for popular audiences. Their gift for fluid prose in part flows from their clarity of thought, and in part from a core enthusiasm for sharing their ideas broadly and seeing them applied in the real world rather than sitting in technical academic journals. It's also worth pointing out that just as Niall has pulled network theory into history, Laszlo has pulled history into data science. Laszlo's father was a historian, and so it runs in the family. With his book Bursts, he forecasts the rise of big data before big data had a name, raising prescient questions about the ethics of personal data collection and its use by corporations and the state. The book also charts the history of a peasant uprising in medieval Hungary as a means to pose questions about the nature of predictability, the evolution of power structures, and the core challenges of historiography. So as you can see, there is indeed a great deal of topical overlap between the work of our two speakers, and a lot of different directions this conversation can take. In fact, it's almost a law of network theory that it starts to infect the mind with an endless cascade of ideas. And so what we'll do now is hand the stage over to Niall and Laszlo to delve into whatever topics they see fit. We'll eavesdrop on their conversation for a while, and then moving from the ivory tower to the square, let them open it up to all of you for questions. And we'll wrap up the evening with a book signing. Finally, I hope all of you will use tonight's occasion to add some new links to your own network here at the Harvard Club, and that you end up making some new friends. And so, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Niall Ferguson and Laszlo Barabasi.
Well, thank you, John. I think this is rather like an Oxford tutorial. Indeed, there are some Oxford dons who have rooms almost this large. And in an Oxford tutorial, it's the undergraduate who humbly offers his thoughts to the learned Don, and I think that's roughly how the roles will be this evening. I want to be the undergraduate offering some thoughts from my new book, rather like a timorous second year with an essay that he wrote rather hastily the night before. Let me begin by paying tribute to Laszlo. His book, Linked, is an absolute must-read for our time. It's a wonderful example of how to do popular science. It introduces all the key concepts that you need to understand in this extraordinary world of networks, and it does it with a light touch and a vivid turn of phrase. And what I said in Budapest, I meant. It was, of all the books I read when I was teaching myself about network science, it was the one that I was most excited by. This is the kind of book that begins by juxtaposing a teenage hacker of the internet with Paul and the spread of Christianity. Almost the best explanation of the 6 degrees of separation idea that I've ever read. I could go on, but I think you've been flattered quite enough for one night. Let me sketch out what I tried to say in my book, and then you can be the Oxford Don and pick holes in it. Remember, if you're the son of a historian, I'm the son of a physicist. And this is a wonderful illustration of how network science allows interdisciplinary work, more almost than anything else I can think of. In reading about network science, I not only worked with physicists, but also with sociologists, people who work on neuroscience or dealing with networks. Once you walk around the Stanford campus, in the course of a day, you'll meet people working on networks in almost every conceivable field. So history is a latecomer to this party. A few historians have been writing about social networks, but in somewhat isolated areas. There's terrific work on the network of the Enlightenment being done at Stanford, but there's nothing, to take just one example, on the networks of political extremism that played such a devastating part in European history in the 20th century. So my attempt was to introduce some history to the people who work on networks, especially the people in Silicon Valley, my new neighbors, now that I'm at Stanford. They think history began with the Google IPO and everything else is the Stone Age. The book is partly designed to give them a history lesson, but it's also partly designed to encourage other historians to think about networks. One of the starting points of the book is an analogy, and it's an analogy with the impact that the printing press had on Europe in the 16th and 17th and indeed the 18th centuries. The argument of the book is essentially that the printing press then played a very similar role to the personal computer and the internet in our time. It created the possibility for larger and faster networks than had previously been possible. And if we had only spent a little more time thinking about that era, we might have been less surprised by some of the unexpected consequences of creating a networked world. So let me begin with really the first hypothesis of the book, and that is that we shouldn't have been surprised when large online social networks turned out to be very polarized rather than to form the global community that Mark Zuckerberg used to talk about. The analogy here is that Martin Luther thought he would create a global community if everybody could read the Bible in the vernacular on a printed copy. They would be able to have a direct relationship with God without the mediation of a corrupt clergy, and everything would be awesome. This is essentially the same idea that arose in Silicon Valley in the 1990s. If we were all connected, then everything would be awesome. And Mark Zuckerberg has made that argument. But John Perry Barlow, who died, alas, this week, was making it in the mid-1990s. So hypothesis number one, we should not have been surprised that our own giant social networks online behaved a bit like the networks created by the printing press. They quite quickly polarized, and the structure was quite different from the one that was expected. Am I right in thinking about the problem that way?
You are absolutely right, but of course, as a network scientist, I need to pack this out, right? and first of all, let me just say, since you is that I am so delighted that the historian of your statehood actually is willing to look at networks and rethink history from a network perspective, because absolutely that is needed, and I have not seen such a good argument about why history should be occasionally viewed as a network phenomenon as in your book. And I also like the balance that those of you who haven't had a chance to read the book, right away, Niall sets out the fact that it's not everything should be viewed as a network, right? There are parts of history where the hierarchies really matter, where governments matter and so on, but then there are major transitions in the historical process where networks play an essential role, and I really like a lot this balance and kind of looking at the both sides. But if we think about surprises, indeed one thing is to say, well, there's a polarization. To me, the intellectual surprise is, why did it take so long for us as a community to start realizing that just about anything we do in our life has imprints in some kind of network, right? Why did we have to wait till the 1990s, end of 1990s, to have something that we call a network science, right? And why does it take so long for the scientific community to really absorb that in a connected world, it's very difficult to talk about individuals as people, as institutions, as organizations, as phenomena without looking at the dependencies that we have. So my journey really started with almost 20 years ago when I realized that even though the network is a paradigm and as a word does exist, no one is really thinking about that, right? And kind of taking it from there and developing the concept that not only that we have networks, but they are measurable. They determine our life, right? Our biological existence is the genetic network. Social existence is the professional social network, and you can continue communication networks and so on. And that's where roughly through the last 20 years, network science has been born, and kind of slowly coming back to your question. The major advances that we have achieved in the last 20 years was the realization that we have these networks and the shocking realizations that these networks are more similar to each other than different. Why is that important? The claim here is that the way the genes connect within our cells as an architecture is not so different from the social network, not so different from the World Wide Web. There are the same architectural elements showing up. There are a couple of hubs who are very highly connected nodes. They're predictable how many they should be in all of these networks, communities, and we can continue having another 2 hours of network science lesson to tell you how many commonalities are there, right? So why is this universality important? Is because it gives us a unified language that historians, biologists, computer scientists, sociologists, everybody can rely on, and we're talking about the same. And the achievement that we had as a community in the last 20 years was to understand the structural issue. Now, polarization is a problem about this. It's something on the network, right? It's like we have this network, we are constrained by this network, the network creates opportunities, and the question is, how do we use that? So in order to understand the polarization process, you need to define the dynamics of how the nodes interact with each other, the possibility of coloring the nodes, right, different colors, and whether the different colors like each other or not. Once you have this additional element, then in any network where there is some repulsion or some difference between two different types of nodes, the polarization will happen, whether that's printing press, whether that's the internet, and in a way, in the cells as well.
It's interesting that this strand of thought really originated with sociologists writing in the 1960s and 70s about social networks in American high schools. And the observation that attempts at integration were being thwarted in US high schools because of a self-segregation phenomenon is really crucial in the development of homophily or homophily, depending on how you want to pronounce that word, as a theoretical construct in network sociology. To me, it was very important to recognize that, at least in the realm of social networks, the idea that birds of a feather flock together was extremely important, and that in social networks we should not be surprised to see clusters form. This is your point about network architecture. What we would be amazed by would be if a social network were like a lattice. Let's just take this group of people here, mostly members of a club, which is a social network with a long tradition. If we graphed the people in this room, and we could do it, we could find out how they were connected to one another. We could find out which nodes, each of you is a node, I'm afraid, in our eyes, which of the nodes had the most edges, because your relationships are just edges to us. And we could see the network architecture of this relatively small group. It would not be a lattice. You would not all have the same number of connections to one another. Some nodes would be a lot better connected than the rest, and there would probably be some sad network isolates who came here on their own and don't really know anybody. That seems to me to be part of the story that you're telling us, that network architecture does not produce lattices in almost any case.
Correct.
And that when we look at social networks, we should not be surprised to find, for one thing, the kind of polarization that I talked about. But that's not a big theme in your book. You're more interested in this scale-free, power law structure of networks. And I'm hugely interested in that because of another dimension of network science that's very important to historians. Not only are social networks inclined to become polarized in some sense, or at least to form clusters, whether ideological or ethnic, social networks also turn out to be highly inegalitarian because some nodes have just way more edges than others. Talk a bit about this crucial central idea of your book, because it seems to me to have all kinds of implications for, well, inequality, which is something we all think a lot about these days.
That's right. I mean, this was really our biggest intellectual surprise. Just to give you a background, so we're not the first to think about networks, right? The sociologists from the 1960s have been thinking, so did mathematicians. But there was a very well-defined way of thinking about it, is that it's random, that we randomly encounter each other and we may or may not become friends with each other. And if the network is random, it has very precise consequences. So interestingly, randomness is the most predictable feature of a system. One of the consequences of the underlying randomness is that if I would indeed measure how many others know here, so I would graph the graph right here, then what we'll find is that most of you would have roughly the same number of acquaintances in this room. And there would be no outliers, meaning no one would be far more popular than anyone else here in the room, like far more, or no one would actually be the proverbial left behind. So we would follow, all of us, a kind of a bell curve. And the big surprise came in the case of the World Wide Web when we first had a chance to map out a part of the web. This was the time when the Google guys were still putting their search engine up and we were building our search engines. The difference was between their work, there are two differences. We only graphed the links, not the content, you know, like who's connected to whom on the web. And the second difference is the hundreds of billions of dollars that came from that, right?
Bad luck.
But down the line, what we saw, and that was very surprising intellectually, is that the web is not egalitarian as you would expect in a random network, but rather there are a few highly connected nodes, like today Google. And those nodes are not just slightly bigger than everybody else, but hundreds of times so bigger than everybody else. And then we started looking at other systems and turned out that nowhere do we see a random network. Actually, I don't know of any real system that would be random as we've imagined for decades. If we really would do this room and start mapping out, we would realize that probably you're one of the biggest hubs because you have many students showing up over here, and you would be an outlier in this room, and probably you and 2 or 3 other individuals like John, our host, would be actually at the center of this room from the network perspective. And this is what we call a scale-free network. There's a particular mathematical law behind that, and what we learned is that networks naturally evolve into this state where a few major hubs hold many, many small nodes together. They are present in our cells. There are proteins like the p53 gene that is responsible for cancer that connects to hundreds of our genes. They are present, as I said, on the World Wide Web. They are present on the internet. No matter what large network, self-organized network you look at it, you see that. And you were kind of talking about inequality. That is actually very interesting because the whole World Wide Web concept was about equality. This is the medium where anybody's voice could be heard. You can put your web page up and anybody can read it. Except the question is, will they ever find it, right? And this unevenness kind of the scale-freeness means that it's not easy to find it, right? Because we're always gonna find the hubs, but it will be very difficult to find the small guys. And of course, this is what history is about, right? Is like kind of explaining through many, many different ways how this inequality emerges and what it means. And in a way, you talk very nicely about your book at many, many levels, right? Of that, what is the role of these major hubs and how they kind of rule the system. So one thing I was actually very curious about when it comes to, if I may go back, is that you start the book, of course, with the Illuminati. You talk about, Freemasons and so on. And then at a certain moment, you actually make a very interesting statement that I have been trying to wrap my mind around, that it says, it's the successful networks that we don't know about. It's the unsuccessful ones is that everybody talks about. Would you mind expanding on that? That was one of the most interesting sentences in the book.
Well, one of the things that makes social networks difficult for historians to write about is that they have so often attracted the attention of conspiracy theorists. The notion that a secret elite, a secret network, in fact controls the world is a very appealing notion. It has a kind of psychological appeal because it in some ways endows the believer with a special kind of knowledge that everybody else lacks. You may naively watch the television news and believe that President Trump is in charge, but I know the Illuminati are really in control, and if it's not the Illuminati, then it's the Rothschilds, and if it's not the Rothschilds, it's George Soros, and if it's not George Soros, it's aliens. But at any event, there is some secret network that's in control. For historians, this is problematic because one doesn't want to write about the stuff that crazy people write about. You just don't really want to be on the same shelf as those books. I remember discovering that a completely mad person named David Icke had written a completely mad book about the Rothschilds. I was writing a history of the Rothschilds, which was, as far as possible, a scholarly work. But there I was, obliged to read this mad book, if only to take notice of the crazy conspiracy theory that had advanced. The second problem is that if you want to write serious history about those networks, it's hard to do because networks, unlike hierarchical entities like states, don't tend to have the archives department that you can go and visit on Monday at 9 o'clock in the morning. The Illuminati archive didn't exist any more than the mafia has an archive that you can go and consult in Sicily. So it's technically hard to do research on the kind of networks I'm talking about, particularly the covert ones. When you do the research, and there's been some brilliant work done on the Illuminati by German historians in recent years, you discover that far from being all-powerful, the Illuminati were highly unsuccessful. They never had as many as 2,000 members, and the object of the the society, which was to infiltrate Masonic lodges and spread radical Enlightenment ideas, including agnosticism, if not atheism, was entirely missed. After about 10 years, they were set up in the 1770s, the Bavarian authorities shut them down, and that was the end of that. The founder, whose name was Weishaupt, went into exile and wrote many books justifying his failure. Within a few years, this wholly unsuccessful secret network was being credited with the French Revolution and much else besides. And to this day, you can go online, search Illuminati, and find wild castles in the air of conspiracy, alleging that the society continued to exist and in fact controls the world. So this seems to illustrate a paradox about networks, that the most extraordinary power can be attributed to the least successful networks. A very successful network, which you'll never hear a conspiracy theory about, was the network of Scottish emigrants who fanned out from my native land beginning in the 1600s and established colonial outposts all over the world. But you'll never hear any allegations that Burns suppers are a conspiracy against the Republic, or that Highland Games are a facade behind which the Scots plot the control of the world. We actually do control the world to a very large extent, or at least we used to, but nobody's ever made a conspiracy theory about that because it's hidden in plain sight. You can see it hidden in plain sight all over the world, where you'll find people named Ferguson of every shade of skin color imaginable. So I think that's the point, that some networks are very successful, and so successful that there's no conspiracy theory.
Interesting. But actually you said the one that are successful we don't know about. So how that comes around? Because in a way, I mean, when you talk about the lack of successful Illuminati and everybody knows about, yes, but that's kind of one of the fundamental property of the networks is reachability, right? So yes, if you go far enough on the network, and these networks are small words, so you don't have to go too far, you just have to search, you will get the information. It will not be in plain sight, because what's in plain sight are the hubs, right? So the kind of the consensus and so on, but it's searchable, and if you're part of, if you want to kind of think that way, you will find it. In that way, the web has fulfilled its mission, right? You can get to this, which earlier was much harder to get to, right? So, but what I really was surprised about is the claim that the successful we don't hear about. So does that mean that in your mind, there are many success stories in the role of networks in history that you could not get to, partly because, as you said, there is no archive, there is no data. And how do we go about that?
Well, I think the way to understand this problem is to recognize that if a conspiracy theory is being proposed, it is usually a sign that an attack is being contemplated against the network in question. The best example of this, though I could think of many others, is the Jewish financial network that was such a striking feature of European and indeed global history from the 19th century into the 20th century. This network was credited with vast power by anti-Semites on the left as well as on the right, but most violently on the right. And I show in the book that, as is often the case with these stories, the network wasn't imaginary. There was indeed a network of bank houses like the Rothschilds and the Warburgs, but it didn't have the vast power that was attributed to it. And that was revealed by the fact that when it came under direct attack in Germany after 1933, it was wholly unable to resist and was destroyed. The network was dismantled by the Nazis with remarkable ease. So this illustrates, I think, the phenomenon that the conspiracy theory is itself the product of a backlash. Take the Freemasons, who feature in American history, indeed in the history of this town. I show in the book that the men who made the American Revolution, not only in Boston, but in all the the British colonies that rebelled were often, though not always, members of Masonic lodges. And there was a lodge in this town that was an extremely important hub. And the key hubs in the revolutionary network, Joseph Warren and Paul Revere, were members of this particular lodge. The Masons were a rather open part of the American Revolution. George Washington even had his portrait painted in full Masonic regalia. But then came a backlash against the power of the Masons, which was fueled in part by religious revival. I think the first ever party convention in the United States was of the anti-Masonic party. And from that point on, the Masons were written out of the script of the American Revolution. So once again, it was the backlash that started to credit the network with even greater power than it really had.
So should we think of networks as being a disease of the hierarchy? That actually they really are not persistently there. They show up when there is a potential for a crisis. There's a weakness in the system. They invade it, and the system crumples, and something else shows up.
I think the way to get at this, and it's a really important point for the audience this evening, is to recognize that the square and the tower, the network hierarchy distinction in the title of my book, is a false dichotomy. That we're actually dealing here with a continuum of different kinds of network architecture, from the very hierarchical to the very distributed. And this is something that I learned from reading you, that when one has to understand the network structure. To me, one of the interesting stories here is that you can quite quickly, and this is another thing I learned from you, you can quite quickly, with relatively few new connections, change the network structure altogether.
Yes.
A hierarchical structure, take Stalin's Soviet Union, is essentially a network in which the betweenness centrality, the centrality of one node, Stalin, is incredibly high. And everybody really has to go through that one node. And any connections that aren't through the central node are not really allowed, or at least they're viewed with suspicion. Social networking in Stalin's Soviet Union could get you in front of a firing squad or sent to the gulag. So this is the kind of extreme case of a hierarchical structure. Stalin was paranoid, this is well known, but I think you taught me that he was right to be, that a totalitarian state cannot allow unauthorized social networks to form, because they would be those horizontal edges, if you like, that would fundamentally reduce the centrality of the node. And that, I think, is why there's a tension in culture, leaving aside the science for a minute, but a tension in culture between the aspirations of centralizing states or authorities and those networks that exist either secretly or openly, that pose a meaningful threat to that power.
And what is actually amazing about this story is that, you know, there are certain organizations who want to kind of keep the purity of the hierarchy. Yet, the communications between the branches is essential for the hierarchy to work. If you cut the communication between the branches, that's the source of failure, right? Because then suddenly a couple nodes go up. And today, in the company environment, for example, one of the things I even funded many years ago, a company where we would map this out, and we would actually show the management the fact that there are key communications between these parts of the hierarchy, and that's good for you. That's the essence. That kind of helps you to have robustness in the system. So I'm always amused when I see this the hierarchy's fear of losing their purity, while the horizontal communication is really what keeps the hierarchy going and stable in many, many ways, right? And what may happen, one way to look at it, what the role of networks are, is that when the hierarchy is not functioning right, then some of these horizontal links take life of their own and start gaining power within the system.
We should probably take some questions from the audience, from the square. Here we sit in the tower with our microphones, authoritative.
Right, time is passing,
we should take some questions from the floor. Before we do, just a couple of thoughts, which I think we should also introduce into the discussion. Again, thoughts inspired by reading you. The notion that things go viral, to use a popular phrase, because they're inherently attractive, interesting, contagious, is a very appealing one. But one thing that you show, and I think it's vitally important, is that it's network structure that determines virality as much as the inherent contagiousness of the thing that is spreading. Talk a bit about that, because we always hear this phrase, things go viral, and yet I don't think we fully understand what it means.
That is correct. I mean, there's lots of virality, right? The simplest one is we're in a flu season, and so flu kind of passes on through contact. There is the virality of the ideas, and since LINCD was published, we actually have a much better understanding of how virality works, and we know it's not as simple as flu of simply coming in contact with somebody and passing on the idea. When it comes to ideas, people have to accept it. Acceptance requires reinforcement. So as we live in the world where before we pick up a book, we kind of wait to get 3 or 4 pings from other people that, yes, you must read the book. That's the same thing actually often happens with ideas as well. So in a way, previously we thought that the hubs, when it comes to viruses, the hubs play a key role, right? It's like if you infect the hub, everybody will get infected very fast. When it comes to ideas, communities play a key role because communities reinforce the ideas. And the communities have to take it on, and then it can spread from that community. So in a way, now we have to be really kind of paying lots of attention. We call it simple or complex contagion. Simple contagion is the flu, contact is enough and it will spread. Complex contagion will requires actually for all of us to get on board. And in many ways, I think politics and the kind of beliefs in the society are all in the complex contagion area, which again explains polarization, right? Because for ideas to survive, you have to have the community where it can be reinforced. And of course, the ideas serve as a membership in that group, right? In the moment I accept your ideas, then it means that we're brothers in some way at the ideas, and you may have a completely not idea, right? But me actually being on board with you, I'm showing the fact that I'm part of that group, and yes, the sun is blue, but only we see it, right? And then of course we see that in the society today, and that's only possible in case of the complex contagion where communities can reinforce that. In case of a simple influenza, that would not happen.
I'm more and more convinced that one can't understand what has happened in American politics in the last 2 years without understanding the kind of stuff we're discussing, and that the 2016 election was really a tale of multiple networks interacting. For me, it was extraordinarily illuminating to be able to watch the election with these concepts in mind, to see, we haven't mentioned him so far, which I think is a great achievement, he who must not be named, go viral in just the way that you describe, and the same process. This was a complex contagion, and it required reinforcement on social networks to get people entirely on board. One could go on. We could talk about the way that networks are complex systems that undergo phase transitions. We could talk about the way that networks can attack each other, but I think we probably should take some questions from the square now. John, are there microphones for these questions, or do people just shout?
I would say stand and make your voice heard.
Stand and deliver.
There's a hand there.
Yes, there's a lady at the front had a question.
Hi, I'll begin. Assuming what you say about networks and history and biology all being networks, I have basically 3 that might not be connected questions. One is, if networks, if you look at biology, why would you have networks being so, like social networks, you either believe in Fox or CNN, you know what I'm saying? So biologically, a system can't really work if it's like, I'm only doing one function as opposed to another. So is the reason for that because of the social or, psychological aspect of human beings? The other question is, if you look at successful networks and we don't know about them, does it also go back to psychology or, neuroscience? We like to believe the Luminari or Dan Brown books when they weren't all that important because there's something that isn't explained in history per se or networking, but the way that we choose to define it.
So let me take the first one and you take the second one.
Good idea.
So I want to challenge you to think whether actually in nature most networks are as split as what we see in the society.
Oh, should we repeat the question?
Yes. So the first question, the way I understood it, is that society is very polarized, and it's possible to get this completely opposing opinion coexisting, and that's something that's unique to the society that we not see in nature. Think about your brain, the left and the right side, right? There's a very clear split there for good reason, and when we look in the cell, we see lots of compartmentalization, and that's essential because compartments carry function, and the function doesn't want to be messed with other functions. Only when it needs information wants to carry that. So the modularity, the existence of the communities, is a universal feature of most networks. What is special about the society is that we can learn, we can upload software, right, while the cells cannot. So therefore, we have these communities that are an integral part of the network, and we know that communities reinforce ideas, and in a random or non-random way, one or the other ideas get reinforced in different communities, and those ideas also serve to strengthen the community itself, right? So there is a reinforcing process that takes place in a social system much more so than in a biological system. But then how do the Illuminati come in here?
The second question was, I think, how far is it simply that we want to believe or are attracted to the idea of secret and powerful networks? Dan Brown made a couple of bestsellers on the back of this idea.
Being that the most successful networks people don't talk about, like the Highlanders and the Fergusons, as opposed to...
Nobody's made a movie about us. It's a great achievement. But to be serious, I think this is a very important characteristic of political culture over the very long run. If you look at survey data today, a really large proportion of Americans think that there is some secret network that's really running the world. I mean, it's close to half, according to surveys done recently. If you look at the way that the George Soros story keeps being told over and over again, in Hungary and now most recently in the United Kingdom, where there is now Soros is funding a secret plot to reverse Brexit. That was the Daily Telegraph's front page this week. This seems to have a kind of recurrent appeal to our human psyche, the belief that there is some secret conspiracy, some secret network that is behind it all, regardless really of evidence to the contrary. Or rather, we get just enough evidence, because clearly George Soros has a great deal of money and spends a lot of it on not only philanthropy but politics. But we take that evidence and we blow it out of all proportion to make the claim that the Bilderberg group is in fact in charge, or for that matter, the Illuminati. I am not a member of the Illuminati. I want to make that very, very clear indeed. But we should take some questions from others. There's a hand that's gone up over there. Please. Yes, you, sir. Well, the question here, in case you didn't hear, was what do I, as an economic historian, gain from studying network science? And the answer is a huge amount. I'll take a couple of examples of many in the book. The first is that one needs to recognize that we built the first large online network in the financial sector. Before we got to social networks, we had financial networks. And that was because when this stuff was initially being set up, when platforms were initially being built, they were expensive. And the people who could afford to experiment with the technology were, guess who, investment bankers. I had a long debate last night with Ed Lazier of the Hoover Institution about how far we should understand the financial crisis in these ways. Andy Haldane at the Bank of England and Hal Scott at the law school here at Harvard argue that the financial crisis was really a network outage. It was a collapse of a complex network that had evolved very rapidly. Haldane shows just how very quickly international financial centers had become more connected in the run-up to 2008. And when Lehman Brothers failed, it was just a node in the network. People didn't realize how important that node was. And I think, and I would argue this again this evening, I think that the economists who made those decisions around about the financial crisis underestimated the network dimension of what they were contending with and the contagion that spread the crisis very rapidly around the world. So I think that would be one example. I could give others, but Laszlo wants to jump in.
Yes, so actually one of the things that is very peculiar about the financial crisis, which actually happens often in other networks as well, that it's not only the network that gets broken, but there is a flow on the network, in this case money, and it leads to cascading failures. So Lehman Brothers by itself wasn't such an important node from the topology perspective, but there's lots of flow was happening on that. And in the moment you took that out, then that effectively led to a cascading failure throughout the system. And I remember when the crisis was happening and Ricardo Hausmann from the Kennedy School came back just from DC from one of these intense meetings, he himself being an economist, and he said, the way he characterized that, he said, listen, what has happened right now, what is happening is that there used to be a network. There's no more a network. There's one hub, the US government. That's the only source of money, and there is no more horizontal network, and until that gets sorted out, everything is frozen. Yeah. So that's what Lehman Brothers did. It froze the system, actually, because the dependencies killed the system.
Exactly. That's a great way of thinking about it. And Ricardo Hausmann, I'm glad to say, features in my book as one of many sources of inspiration. The other example that I would give you is that to understand our economy today, one needs to understand network economics, the phenomenon of increasing returns to scale, and Zipf's law, Z-I-P-F's law, which says that in certain markets, winner takes all. The winner, number one, gets 90%, runner-up gets 9%, everybody else 0.9%. What am I talking about here? I'm talking about Google, which has a monopoly on search, Amazon on online retail, I'm talking about Facebook, which is a monopoly on social networks. The big tech companies, which are now the biggest companies in the world by market capitalization, are perfect examples of the tendency in certain kinds of market for network winners to take all. Yes. It's not the only possible outcome, as you show in Link. There's a slightly less drastic outcome when a few fit nodes become dominant, but we are confronted in major sectors of the world economy with near monopolies. And that is a profoundly important development which policymakers are really struggling to come to terms with. We are in a new version of the Gilded Age. Here I'm going to do another analogy. We have Carnegie-like figures, John D. Rockefeller-like figures, only the young guys in T-shirts who dropped out of Harvard to start their companies. But these are the new robber barons, and I think it poses a profound challenge to policymakers because it is very hard to break these companies up on the basis of antitrust. In fact, I think attempts to do that will almost certainly fail. So we are in a new world of technology monopolies, and I don't think that they will be very easy at all to break up.
Yep.
There's a gentleman here with a question near the front. Yeah.
With this question, I'm going to ask you to think through today back to, say, World War II, and today forward. Do you think that the network effect has been a democratizing force from, say, World War II to today? And looking ahead, do you think artificial intelligence will make them more or less?
So the question is, if one thinks historically, back to the time of World War II, has the growth of networks been a democratizing force, and what will the advent or development of artificial intelligence imply? I'll have a stab at that, and then Laszlo, maybe you can jump in. I think we were promised democratization by the internet, that we were all going to be netizens, and everybody was going to be empowered to speak truth to power. And we've been duped, because the structure of the public sphere has changed in ways that I think were predictable by network science, because an enormous scale-free network has emerged. And at the top or at the center of this network is a tremendous concentration of power. It's called the algorithm. The phrase that I hear most frequently, and it now makes me shudder slightly, is tweak the algorithm. 45% of Americans get their news from Facebook today. The Facebook algorithm that determines what appears in individual news feeds is the most powerful tool in our democracy, and it is in the control of a single company. That seems to me not to be what we were offered when John Perry Barlow was promising the Declaration of Independence of cyberspace. And I think that in practice, the network platforms that have evolved in the last 15 years pose a fundamental threat to the working of our democracy, because far too much power is now controlled by a very small number of companies. They have more power than William Randolph Hearst had at the height of his power, a bigger share of the news market, and yet they are not regulated as content publishers. Second point, if artificial intelligence fulfills its promise, and we are in the end subordinated to computers that think better than us, and indeed learn in ways we don't even understand, this will not be progress. This will return us to the condition of human beings before the scientific revolution. We will live in a world that functions in ways we do not understand. And that seems to me a very perilous way for us to go, even if we optimize the management of the planet by doing that. Laszlo, what's your thought?
I mean, kind of looking at this time scale, I see a major change that happened, and that is due to globalization. So what happened before globalization is a little bit what happened when the electric grid has started, which is like there were local grids in every city. Boston and New York had its own, and which meant that it was a local production, local consumption, but the trouble stayed and the practices stayed local, right? In the moment people figured out, hey, it's kind of cheaper to start transferring electricity from Boston to New York, because when I don't need it, you can use it. And then across to other cities, suddenly Boston's problems became the whole East Coast problem, and electricity travels with the speed of light. Any disturbance travels with the speed of light, so it became a global problem. What I kind of see what happened in the Second World War is that type of globalization, what happened in the 1940s and 50s in electricity, has now happened in the economy. So previously companies could be only as large as their countries were, right? Because there was a fundamental limit within which they could operate and make money. Now the playground, the whole world, right? There are no boundaries. And that has created these two completely different coexisting networks in the system. There's a political system that still stays local somewhat, and there's an economic system that is completely spreading the whole world. Now, in a way, that was good for democracy, if you think about it, right? I mean, it really spread democracy in a very large way, and many people have written beautiful books about how effective that was, right? But I think we're kind of forgetting the fact that there was this complete spread of the economic force, and now the two forces are depinned. Not in an Illuminati sense, not that the T-shirts are running the world, right? Because they're busy running their own enterprise, but their decisions are affecting everything, right? So if Facebook wants to alter the Hungarian politics, can change the algorithm, right? And can affect it, and can affect many different countries. So what I see happening since the Second World War is the existence of this massive network that is spread around the world, that not as much is controlling our life, but it's affecting, and we're existing within that. And then if you want to really think about how you interpret both the political events and economic events, you cannot ignore the coexistence of these two systems.
Going to point out that your microphone has escaped from your
Oh, I
lapel.
did. Are you able to hear me?
I'm rather impressed that you were still entirely audible, which tells me either that you have a wonderful speaking voice or that the microphone is extraordinarily powerful. The sound engineer did a great job there. I guess, John, do we have time for a couple more questions? Yeah, so we mustn't miss, there's a lady there who's just raised her hand, and I think I saw some over there, so shall we, we'll go to you first. So the question is, how do perceptions of the network or of networks change over time? This is a great question. The word network really wasn't used until relatively recently. You'll look for it in vain in Shakespeare's plays. You won't even find it in Trollope's novels. Hierarchy, of course, is a word that goes back a very long way indeed and was central to the evolution of Christianity. But the network starts to be used as a term with the advent of rail networks, telegraph networks. And that's really, if we want to just trace the history of the word, its starting point. It doesn't start to be used with reference to social networks until well into the 20th century. And so part of what we're doing here, I think, is encouraging the evolution of this concept still further. We got to the point in the 1980s and 90s when it was a verb to network. Oh, I'm going out networking. That was in the days of filofaxes and Rolodexes. And I think we've now reached a point at which people use the word network all the time, completely casually. I did a random search in the New York Times just 1 week or 1 day when I was writing the book to see in how many stories the word network appeared. And it was ludicrous because it was in almost every story, casually used. I think what we're trying to do is to encourage people to think more analytically about networks so that they don't just use the term casually, but understand that they're referring to something that can be graphed, that has an architecture and isn't just a nebulous conspiratorial or in other ways sinister thing.
But I would add that there's lots of areas where the variance of the network has changed the network, and one of them would be obviously terrorism, right? So if you happen to be in one of those countries where that's an issue, people are very, very aware of the network effects, very aware of the traceability thanks to the networks, very aware that it's not only about me, but it's about my environment. And it's very aware of the fact that we kind of don't recognize why is the social network so important, right? And the way I like to put it is that if you look at my friends on Facebook, just by looking at them and not at me, you would know everything about me. You would know where I come from. You would know roughly what is my education level, what I do. And that's why networks are so important, because the links are carrying information. If they would not be carrying information, then we would not have any useful things coming out of it. So like you could connect every Niall to every Niall and every Laszlo to every Laszlo. That would be a mathematically well-defined network that you can define in the society, but it would have no relevance whatsoever because there's no causality or no information transfer along those links. In social networks, in communication networks, these links are informative. That's why the cops are trying to first find out who are the friends of the bad guys, because they know they're going to find among them other bad guys. So in a way, I think that there are certain areas where awareness of the network is changing the people's behavior, and they're changing the network. And obviously, there are lots of covert networks, groups of individuals who spend much of their time trying to cover their tracks and be disconnected in the network or be connected in the network that doesn't reveal their real intent.
So some of the most interesting literature I read as I was doing the book concerns terrorist networks. A lot of effort has gone into trying to understand those, beginning with the graphing of the network of the 9/11 plotters and carrying on to our studies on Islamic State. So it's a pretty fertile field, and it's probably the only way to beat these organizations. Stan McChrystal learnt the hard way in Iraq that it takes a network to defeat a network. Shall we take one more network question before we retire for the evening? I don't know who's been most patient. Well, I think the gentleman with the blue shirt who's there had his hand up last time. So why don't you go, sir?
So I guess this question is a little bit with regards more to sort of how I identify myself and what networks I'm a part of. I guess there's a sort of like a sociological idea that I can have sort of 150 people or something in that relationship that I know. And I guess if you look historically, that might have been my village or whatever area I happen to live in. And the network I would have been a part of is probably I have 150 links to the 150 people, and they all have links to the same. I guess as you change your ability to define new networks that involve you, presumably you change the characteristics by which you get membership in these networks and the ways that they become self-reinforcing change. And so I'm curious, as you go from that sort of historical view to today, where I might be actually a node in many different networks, and my set of networks that I'm a node of with it is completely different than even people who are very close to me. Does that result in sort of a changing and a watering down of the number of links that I can have in the network? And I guess more normatively, what's the solution to keeping your identity and the self-reinforcing nature of positive networks around you, and how can you kind of combat that diffusing element?
Sure. Can I take a first stab on that? So you have raised, of course, so many questions that you would take like 4 hours to cover all of them.
I was thinking the same.
And one of them, of course, that, the 150, that's what we call the one of the Dunbar numbers, right? And that's really about the number of what is the largest community that can exist as a horizontal organization without having to kind of organize themselves into a hierarchy. So that's the smallest unit before or the largest unit before the hierarchy. We often don't get to experience that much. That's really not our social network. That talks about your ability to coordinate. But the overlapping community is the other side. So we are part of multiple communities, right? I'm Hungarian from Transylvania. So I have an entity in Budapest. I have an entity from Transylvania. I work at Harvard. I work at Northeastern. I'm a network scientist. I'm a physicist. These are all overlapping communities, each of them with their own identity. And I have to manage it, and you manage it, and we all learn to manage it throughout life in a seamless way, right? And we know who belongs where, who is the family, and who is the tennis partner, right? So I don't think that there is something new in that respect. These were actually part of what we did before. What has changed, however, thanks to social media and social networks, is that in the past, let's say 100 years ago, if I would have moved from Transylvania to Hungary and then to United States, I would have had to sever my links, right? So because there was no way of keeping them active through that distance. Now we have the full inventory of the social network that we ever belonged to at our disposal at any time. There's no way we can satisfy this social network fully, right? So we obviously communicate much more with the local people and much less with a few exceptions at home. But these weak links have grown in importance, and they are easily activable in a way that was not possible 100 years ago. So when I go home from Transylvania, for example, I know what's happening there because I see my friends on Facebook, right? So I'm kind of still aware of that. So if there was a major change, is this kind of global awareness of your full social network that was simply technically not possible, or you had to sever those links.
David Rockefeller had a Rolodex with 100,000 people in it. Wow. So he, I think, must have been the ultimate networker of the pre-online network age. Very few people can remember even 200 names, never mind maintain a list of 100,000 or 200,000. So I think the key issue here, which will perhaps conclude with, and which your question raised in my mind, is whether there's a tension between the large online social networks and the traditional social networks like what we're doing now in a club founded many years ago. There's a big debate about this within the world of sociology between those who think that Facebook is killing local networks and those who insist that it in fact helps and enables them. And Mark Zuckerberg, in a great act of self-defense, is arguing that in fact Facebook is going to be far more focused in future on those local networks, and the news feed will be tweaked once again to privilege the local familial ties. I mean, I think the jury is still out on this. One thing that is very clear is that the more young people spend their time on online networks, the more miserable they become, if not clinically depressed. I was very struck indeed by Mark Benioff of Salesforce's remark at Davos this year that social media, and specifically Facebook, were the cigarette smoking of our time, and that we would one day look back and ask, why did we ever allow young people to get addicted to this terrible and damaging drug? That was an amazing thing for a major Silicon Valley figure to say, and a mark, I think, of just how big the backlash now is against the giant network platforms that have been built. And I think that backlash has further to go. In my view, there is a tension. I think there is a kind of fundamental choice between your real network, the network of people you see in real time and real space, and the fake network that can evolve, and evolve it into an absurd size on platforms like Facebook. So I think one has, in fact, to make a choice. And my choice is for real networks. Networks like the Harvard Club of Boston. This is fun. Thanks very much.